Hello, everyone, and welcome back to MC310. This week, we are talking about type. We've just learned all of the definitions of type, typography, and typeface. And now we're going to talk about how to effectively use type in design. So when you think about how many different types of typeface that there are, it can be difficult in design to decide on a font. So the first thing you need to think about, one, is your design plan that you've already created. What kinds of fonts really go with your brand and your voice and your tone? But you also need to think about, where will it be seen? Certain types of fonts are better for certain mediums. So for example, for print, you need to find a font that is readable, suitable to the topic, and visually interesting. So a font like Georgia is better for a print context, where for digital publication, like on a website or on your mobile phone, you really need it to be scannable. It needs to be easy to read. So you kind of want to look for a sans serif font. It needs to be simple. It needs to create the right type of mood, and it needs to be able to change sizes while still being readable. So something like an open sans font might be more appropriate. A billboard, because you are driving by, you need to see it very quickly. So it needs to be very large and very readable. So Helvetica is one of the most popularly used on a billboard. So when you are designing, think about, what am I designing? What medium is it? And how can my audience read it? How does it reflect the mood or the topic? And what will be visually engaging about that font? Now, you also need to consider who's the audience. When you have general readers, a Roman serif font is the best at usually about a 9 to 12 size, because it's easiest to read. In addition, if you have older audiences, then a larger font or larger letter forms might be helpful due to eyesight deterioration. Teens usually respond to more eye-catching fonts, while children need regular geometric forms and don't need highly stylized fonts because they're just learning letter forms. So, do you need more than one font? Usually the answer is yes, but sometimes it's not. But a lot of times you need different kinds of fonts to differentiate roles. For example, a headline and a subhead, and then subheadings within the body of your story and the copy of your story will all use different fonts, or at the very minimum, a different stylized version of a typeface. So you may not be using multiple typefaces. Maybe you're using different sizes or different fonts. But you're trying to decide on whether you want more than one look. In addition, using more than one font allows you to control navigation. So if you have something that is bolded as opposed to regular, your eye is going to be drawn to that. So it can create a signpost for your readers to say, hey, look at this. It can also add interest if you have a headline or a particular word that you really want to be seen. Maybe you make that more stylized so it stands out and it draws the eye to that particular feature. Or you could introduce drama. So certain words and fonts, when created with contrast, can tell its own story. We also want to think about font relationships, how different fonts on the same page work together. So a concordant font relationship means that it's all one type family. So it's the same typeface, but it uses different fonts, either in style, size, or weight. So on the left, you see that here we have the same font. It's just used at different point sizes as well as letter spacing. They use uppercase versus story case on the top and bottom. So you can see that this all kind of flows together in a concordant relationship, but it's all one type family. On the right, you see a contrast type family where you're actually using different typefaces that are intentionally different and have contrast built in. So here you see that we're using League Spartan at a 57 in an uppercase, then a Libre Baskerville font in italic at 27 points. So not only are the style, size, and weight different, but it's an entirely different typeface. But this goes together because they contrast so much. Whereas if you were to do different typefaces that are somewhat similar but different, they actually conflict a lot and you're able to notice the difference and they don't work together harmoniously. This is called conflicting fonts and we want to avoid that. So if you are using more than one font on a page, you want to make sure that those fonts or typefaces contrast with one another enough that they differentiate on the page. So again, remember opposites attract. Don't use similar types of fonts. It looks like a mistake. So make them purposefully different so your reader knows that it was intentional that you were using two different types of fonts. Here is a good example of combining fonts where one is more prominent than the others. Les Menu is written in a script font while the others are written in a similar typeface, but then the lead, pistachio as a flavor, and then its description are different because the flavor is bolded while the other is regular or light. And so you can see how this creates a nice contrast, but doesn't jar you like a conflicting font relationship would. Now, when you're combining fonts, there are a couple of key tips to keep in mind. The first is to give one font top billing and let the others support it. So you want to make one section of your font be the most bold. So in this design, for example, Open Plan Life is the most bold. It has top billing. So nothing else should look like that top billing font. The other fonts should support it. They should go hand in hand with it, but allow that one to stand out. So you want to have one font that dominates the others. Less is usually more unless you were intentionally trying to create chaos, like with the example of better here on the left. You usually want to stick to 2 or 3 fonts maximum. So, or at least 2 to 3 typefaces maximum. So here you have, this kind of beautiful serif that almost has a script design to it with the graniflora, but then you have something a little more elegant. Now these are actually the same font. One is just all uppercase and bolded, while the other is sentence cased and a little bit lighter. So and then the Botanica Library and Orchids are actually the exact same font, but we use placement as well as sizing to differentiate those. So having only 2 typefaces is recommended, but you can still change up the fonts as long as they are harmonious together. Now, when we are using different types of fonts, we also want to think through ranks or hierarchies. And what this means is that it helps the reader understand the order in which they are supposed to read something. And so your typeface should reflect the importance of the content that it is representing. Most designs have 3 layers of hierarchy: what you are drawn to, then some supporting material, and then the details. So if you were reading a newspaper article, for example, your headline would be the largest, the most important. It is meant to grab your attention. Then you might have a summary or a subhead, and that provides a little bit of a detail, but not enough to tell you the whole story. And then in smaller font, you would have the rest of your copy that would have the rest of the article. The same idea translates to design, where you kind of have one eye-catching larger font, then you have something smaller that kind of supports that. And then you have even smaller for details. So think about hierarchies and how you want to create your design. So there are different ways to create hierarchies within typeface. The first is size. Larger type denotes something to be more important. Using all uppercase can attract attention, make it seem like more important information, but keep in mind it's hard to read. So you want to use it sparingly and only with short pieces of text. The weight or how wide or thin it is also changes it, where heavier fonts are deemed more important by the eye. The position on the page, typically hierarchies move from top to bottom, but you can play with this within design, and we'll talk about that when we talk about layout. Color can also denote different hierarchies, but because we want font to be readable, we want to use color sparingly. And we'll talk about that when we talk about color next week. Forms such as all caps, lowercase, Roman or italics, bold or regular, all of these are different forms of the font. And so we need to think about how those are going to be used, the direction. So whether we're slanting them, whether it's vertical or horizontal, that can change the hierarchy and how we interpret it. But keep in mind, we read from left to right traditionally in our culture. And so we want to avoid type that is slanted or that moves from right to left. Also, we want to create contrast. So creating different typefaces or the structure of the font, those can create hierarchies as well. We also want to think about size versus scale. So in design, size is a fixed point, such as a 12-point font. Only one object we can talk about in size. When we talk about scale, though, we're talking about one element in relation to other elements. So you will always look at the biggest element first within a design or a layout. And so that's why it's important to know the size of each element, because it's going to change the scale of that element in relation to other objects around it. So here on the left, they are the same size because they are scaled in relation to one another. They look the same. But here we have this one in a smaller size. This one is a bigger size on the right. And so the scale of the right one looks so much larger because it is placed next to one that is so small, and vice versa. Other type tips for you: all caps are difficult to read, so they're good for headers or grabbing attention, but you want to avoid unless you have a reason to use it. Also, when you're underlining things, do not use the font feature that is within a typeface. Instead, you want to actually draw a line within your design program. There are many reasons for this, but just know that we don't traditionally use the underline feature for a typeface. Also, we want to avoid widows and orphans. This is when you have just one word that kind of sticks out either at the beginning or the end of a paragraph. Instead, you kind of want to have nice blocks of text. Punctuation should be styled with the text. So, for example, if a word is bolded, the period that comes right after it should also be bolded. It should all work together because the punctuation is part of that text. You want to give text room to breathe if it's in a box. So make sure that you have enough space around the text so that it is readable and also stands out and doesn't look cramped. And don't use hyphens for bullets. Either use bullet points or other design elements. Now that you understand a little bit more about fonts and layouts, make sure that you finish your discussion on type and then do your reading for next week on color theory. If you have any questions about fonts, typeface, or the definitions that we've covered, please make sure you reach out. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next week when we talk about color theory.